In Newton County, Arkansas, within the remote Ozark Mountains, 28 trappers vanished without a trace between 1897 and 1899. Living 15 miles from the nearest settlement on their late father's homestead were Sisters Mercy and Temperance Caldwell, isolated moonshiners. A nightmare was uncovered by Deputy Sheriff Ezra Thornton in 1899 when a dying trapper stumbled into town, raving about a breeding program and underground chambers. A labyrinth sprawled beneath the sisters' home where men were chained, subjects in their divine quest to forge a pure mountain bloodline. How did such horror thrive unseen? And what darkness ferments when isolation and faith entwine? Subscribe to stand with us as we document the story's history buried, and comment your city and local time so we know where these dark truths reach across the world. The landscape of the Buffalo National River region in 1897 seemed to exist outside the boundaries of civilization itself. Mountains so steep were covered in dense forests of oak and hickory that sunlight barely reached the valley floors even at midday. Scattered across this wilderness like forgotten islands were settlements, some consisting of no more than 3 or 4 families living days apart by treacherous mountain trails. No telegraph lines strung these communities together. No railroads penetrated the Ozarks' heart, and within reasonable distance were no sheriff's offices. Should trouble arise, a man could disappear into these mountains and never be found, swallowed by terrain that had claimed countless lives since the first settlers pushed westward into Arkansas territory. What little infrastructure existed had been devastated by the Civil War, and by the 1890s, the region remained stubbornly resistant to the progress transforming the rest of America. For families struggling to survive in this isolated wilderness, one reliable source of income was offered by the mountains: fur trapping. Every autumn, men would venture into the remote valleys along the Buffalo River system, seeking beaver, mink, and otter, whose pelts could be sold for desperately needed cash in the small trading posts scattered throughout Newton County. An existence that locals considered eccentric but unremarkable by mountain standards had been carved out by the Caldwell sisters into this harsh landscape. Their father, Josiah Caldwell, had been a moonshiner of some reputation, operating a still deep in a hollow 15 miles from the nearest settlement of Parthenon. His daughters Mercy and Temperance inherited the 160-acre homestead when he died in a hunting accident in 1895, continuing his illegal whiskey production. In late 1896, traveling peddler James Whitmore encountered them during one of his regular circuits through the region. He would later recall the visit with uncomfortable clarity. A weathered cabin that seemed to grow out of the mountainside itself was where the sisters lived, surrounded by several outbuildings and what appeared to be root cellars carved directly into the hillside behind the main structure. All business with Whitmore was conducted by Mercy, the elder sister, while Temperance remained silent, watching him with an unsettling intensity that made the peddler anxious to conclude his transaction and depart. The sisters' purchasing habits were what struck Whitmore as unusual. Despite their apparent poverty and isolated circumstances, expensive fabric, quality metal tools, and other goods that seemed beyond the means of simple moonshiners were what they bought. He noted this oddity, but dismissed it as typical mountain family thriftiness, perhaps the result of years of careful saving. In silver coins, the sisters paid and seemed particularly interested in purchasing heavy chain and metal hardware, which Mercy explained was needed for securing livestock against the bears and mountain lions that prowled the hollow. That same year, the first disappearances began, though no one immediately recognized them as part of a pattern. In October 1897, a trapper named Robert Finch failed to return from his seasonal hunting expedition along the Buffalo River. Through the winter, his family in Missouri waited, assuming he had extended his stay to maximize his catch, or had perhaps decided to seek opportunities further west. Without word, spring arrived, and they filed a missing persons report with authorities in Harrison, Arkansas, but held little hope of resolution. Regularly, men disappeared in the mountains, victims of bear attacks, falls from treacherous cliffs, exposure during unexpected winter storms, or simple decisions to abandon their old lives and start fresh elsewhere. Their secrets were kept by the mountains, and families learned to accept losses without answers. By the spring of 1899, 7 men had vanished in the same general territory. All were experienced trappers familiar with wilderness survival and the specific dangers of the Ozark Mountains. Unlike typical disappearances, these men left no traces. No abandoned campsites, no scattered equipment, no remains that might indicate animal attacks or accidental deaths were found by search parties. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist the moment they entered that particular stretch of wilderness. Reports were filed by families, but local authorities lacked the resources to conduct extensive searches across 50 square miles of brutal terrain. Among Newton County residents, the consensus was that the missing men had either fallen victim to the mountain's natural hazards in ways that concealed their remains, or had deliberately disappeared to escape debts, family obligations, or legal troubles. A man not inclined to accept convenient explanations when the evidence suggested otherwise was Deputy Sheriff Ezra Thornton. At 42 years old, he had spent nearly 15 years in law enforcement after returning from the Civil War with a limp that never properly healed and a mind trained to notice patterns others missed. For Union forces, he had served as a scout and tracker during the war, learning to read terrain and human behavior with equal precision. That same methodical approach now drew his attention to the missing persons reports accumulating on his desk in the spring of 1899. 7 experienced trappers, all vanishing within an 18-month period, all from the same general area along the Buffalo River system. Him troubled was the statistical improbability. Mountain accidents claimed lives certainly, but the most common hazards were known to be avoided by experienced woodsmen. These were not greenhorns seeking adventure, but professional trappers with families depending on their seasonal income, men who understood the risks and took appropriate precautions. Weeks were spent by Thornton reviewing each case, interviewing family members, and mapping the last known locations of the missing men. A pattern emerged that strengthened his conviction that something beyond natural causes was at work. The same remote territory had been worked by each trapper, a stretch of wilderness centered roughly 15 miles southeast of Parthenon. That area was avoided by local trappers now, though few could articulate exactly why beyond vague feelings of unease. When Thornton pressed for specifics, he learned that the region was dominated by the Caldwell Homestead, where 2 sisters continued their deceased father's moonshining operation. Any connection was dismissed by most locals. The Caldwell sisters were strange, certainly, but mountain folk were generally eccentric by town standards, and there seemed no logical reason why 2 isolated women would have any involvement in the disappearance of strong, capable men. In late April 1899, Thornton made his first expedition into the territory, accompanied by a local guide familiar with the treacherous trails leading to the Caldwell property. The journey required 2 days of hard travel through terrain that seemed designed to discourage visitors. The guide explained that the Caldwell family had always valued their isolation, with old Josiah Caldwell reportedly choosing this particular hollow specifically because its remoteness would allow his illegal distilling operation to continue without interference. 2 women who seemed to embody the harsh landscape that had shaped them were what Thornton found himself studying when they finally reached the homestead. Nearly 6 feet tall stood Mercy Caldwell, an unusual height for a woman of that era, with prematurely gray hair and piercing blue eyes that met his gaze with unsettling directness. Her younger sister, Temperance, remained silent throughout the encounter, watching Thornton with the patient stillness of a predator observing potential prey. Carefully, Thornton explained his investigation, presenting himself as simply trying to account for missing trappers who might have passed through the area. With apparent cooperation, Mercy responded, acknowledging that trappers occasionally stopped at their homestead, seeking to trade for supplies or moonshine. Several such encounters were recounted by her, providing details that demonstrated remarkably precise memory of men she claimed to have met only briefly. When Thornton inquired about specific missing individuals, various explanations were offered by Mercy. One had mentioned plans to continue west to California. Another had seemed troubled by personal matters and spoke of starting fresh elsewhere. Several had simply passed through without incident, and she assumed they had moved on to more productive hunting grounds. Plausible were her explanations, delivered in a calm voice that quoted scripture with the casual familiarity of someone for whom biblical passages formed the framework of daily thought. Yet, inconsistencies that troubled him were noted by Thornton's trained observation. In apparent poverty, the sisters lived, their clothing worn and patched, their cabin showing signs of hard use and minimal maintenance. but he observed quality tools leaning against the outbuildings, expensive fabric visible through the cabin's open door, and a general prosperity of supplies that seemed at odds with their circumstances. When he asked to look around the property, Mercy agreed readily to showing him the main cabin and immediate outbuildings, but subtly steered him away from the hillside behind the homestead, where several heavy wooden doors were built into the rock face. Not through methodical investigation, but through desperate circumstance and remarkable survival came the breakthrough in the Caldwell case. On September 12, 1899, a man stumbled into Harrison, Arkansas in the early morning hours. His clothes were torn and filthy, his body covered in infected wounds that spoke of days spent crawling through wilderness terrain. In the street outside Dr. Marcus Henderson's residence, he collapsed, barely conscious and burning with fever. The severity of the man's condition was immediately recognized by the doctor, and he had him carried inside for treatment. The stranger's injuries included deep lacerations on his wrists and ankles consistent with restraints, severe malnutrition suggesting prolonged captivity, and infected wounds on his legs that appeared to have been sustained during a desperate escape through dense undergrowth and over rocky terrain. As Dr. Henderson worked to stabilize his patient, the man drifted in and out of fevered consciousness, speaking in fragments that the doctor initially dismissed as delirium, but certain phrases repeated with disturbing consistency. The breeding room, the sisters' cellar, chains in the darkness, other men screaming. Henderson recognized that these statements, whether born of fever or reality, suggested something far beyond a simple hunting accident or wilderness misadventure. Immediately, he sent for Deputy Thornton and began recording everything his patient said during moments of lucidity. Over the next 3 days, as infection ravaged the man's weakened body, a horrifying story emerged in pieces that Dr. Henderson carefully documented in his medical journal. The man identified himself as Samuel Morrison, a 29-year-old trapper from Tennessee who had come to Arkansas in early 1899 seeking better hunting territory. In late August, he had encountered the Caldwell sisters while scouting trap lines near their property. Mercy had invited him to their cabin, offering to trade moonshine for information about good hunting areas. An opportunity to establish a supply relationship that might prove valuable during the long winter months ahead was seen by Morrison, so he accepted. He remembered drinking from a cup Mercy provided, then nothing until he awakened in complete darkness, his wrists and ankles shackled with heavy chains anchored to bedrock walls. Not alone was he in the underground chamber. Other men were confined there as well, some barely coherent after what Morrison estimated must have been months of captivity. Through Morrison's fevered account, Dr. Henderson learned that the sisters maintained an elaborate system of underground chambers carved into the hillside behind their cabin. The captive men were kept in various states of restraint, with the sisters visiting regularly to provide minimal food and water while explaining their divine purpose. Extensively, Mercy had spoken about preserving pure mountain bloodlines, about being chosen vessels for God's plan to create a race uncorrupted by modern civilization. Plans for breeding programs, for creating children who would inherit the strength and intelligence she carefully selected in her captives, had been detailed by her. Circumstances he could barely articulate even in his delirium were described by Morrison being forced into, subjected to the sisters' twisted attempts to fulfill what they believed was their sacred duty. Through a combination of opportunity and desperation had come his escape. Temperance had been careless during one feeding, leaving his wrist restraints slightly loose. Over several days, Morrison had worked at the chains during the long hours of darkness, eventually managing to free one hand. He had waited for the right moment, then overpowered Temperance during her next visit, stealing her knife and fleeing into the wilderness. From both the sisters' resistance and his panicked flight through miles of treacherous terrain came his injuries, driven by terror that they would recapture him before he could reach civilization. The final miles to Harrison had been crawled by him, his strength nearly exhausted, sustained only by the desperate need to warn others about what waited in that hollow. Samuel Morrison died on September 15, 1899, 3 days after reaching Harrison. The infection in his wounds had spread too far for the limited medical treatments available in rural Arkansas to combat. But before he died, during his final hours of lucidity, he provided Dr. Henderson and Deputy Thornton with enough specific details about the Caldwell property to guide an investigation. The location of the concealed cellar entrance, the layout of the underground chambers, and most critically, names of other men he had encountered during his captivity were described by him. Men whose families had filed missing persons reports that now sat on Thornton's desk. The evidence Thornton needed was provided by Samuel Morrison's testimony, but obtaining legal authority to raid the Caldwell homestead proved far more challenging than simply presenting the facts. Skepticism about a dying man's fevered statements was expressed by county officials, particularly claims that seemed to defy logic and human decency. That two isolated mountain women were systematically capturing and imprisoning strong, capable men seemed implausible to those who had never ventured into the extreme isolation where the Caldwell sisters lived. 2 weeks were spent by Thornton navigating bureaucratic resistance, documenting Morrison's account, and finally convincing state authorities that the situation warranted federal involvement. The remote location and severity of the allegations meant that any confrontation would require more resources than Newton County could provide. By early October 1899, a force of 6 federal marshals willing to undertake the dangerous expedition into the mountains had been assembled by Thornton. The raid commenced on October 8, 1899, with Thornton's party departing Harrison before dawn. A full day of hard travel was required for the journey to the Caldwell homestead, and Thornton used the time to brief the marshals on what Morrison's testimony suggested they might encounter. Caution was emphasized by him, noting that the sisters had maintained their operation for years through a combination of isolation, careful victim selection, and apparently sophisticated methods for subduing men far stronger than themselves. When the party finally approached the hollow in late afternoon, Thornton divided his force, positioning men to block potential escape routes, while he and 2 marshals approached the main cabin directly. The property appeared deserted, with smoke rising from the cabin's chimney being the only sign of occupation. Thornton called out, identifying himself and demanding that the Caldwell sisters present themselves. The response came not from the cabin, but from the hillside behind it, where Mercy Caldwell emerged from one of the heavy wooden doors built into the rock face. What followed happened with terrible swiftness. Mercy stood motionless for a moment, her tall frame silhouetted against the mountain behind her, then reached into her dress and withdrew a small vial. Before Thornton could react, she consumed its contents and collapsed. The marshals rushed forward, but found her already convulsing, foam appearing at her lips, as the poison she had prepared for exactly this circumstance took effect. She died within minutes, her body going still as Thornton knelt beside her, realizing that whatever knowledge she possessed about the full scope of their crimes would die with her. The commotion brought Temperance from inside the cellar entrance, and unlike her sister, she chose violence over suicide. With a hunting knife, she attacked the nearest marshal, moving with the silent speed that had made her an effective hunter of both animals and men. In self-defense, the marshal fired, the shot striking Temperance in the chest. She fell beside the cellar entrance, dying before Dr. Henderson, who had accompanied the party, could attempt treatment. With both sisters dead, the grim task of searching the property that Morrison had described in such disturbing detail was faced by Thornton. A tunnel carved through bedrock was what the cellar entrance that Mercy had emerged from led into, descending into the mountain itself. Torches were lit by the marshals, and they began their exploration, finding that the underground complex exceeded even Morrison's descriptions. Multiple chambers branched off from the main tunnel, some containing crude living spaces with straw mattresses and buckets, others fitted with chains and restraints anchored directly into the stone walls. Thick with the smell of human waste, unwashed bodies, and something worse that the experienced lawman recognized immediately as the scent of death and decay was the air. In the 3rd chamber, they found 3 living victims, not the adult men they had expected, but children ranging in age from approximately 3 to 7 years, huddled together in the darkness. Extreme fear of the torchlight and the strangers entering their prison was shown by the children, retreating to the farthest corner of the chamber and making sounds that barely qualified as human speech. Slowly, Dr. Henderson approached, speaking in soft tones, and gradually coaxed the children into accepting his presence. Their physical condition shocked even men accustomed to the hardships of mountain life. Severe malnutrition, untreated infections, and skin so pale it appeared translucent from years without sunlight. These children had been born in the cellar system, raised in complete darkness, knowing nothing of the world beyond their underground prison. The full horror of what the Caldwell sisters had created in their mountain hollow was revealed by the deeper chambers. Beyond the living quarters where the 3 children had been found, the tunnel system extended into a series of burial chambers where the sisters had disposed of their victims. 28 bodies in various stages of decomposition were recorded by Deputy Thornton's methodical documentation, some reduced to skeletal remains, suggesting they had been dead for years, others showing evidence of more recent death. The primitive forensic capabilities of 1899 Arkansas limited investigators' ability to determine exact causes of death or establish precise timelines. But a clear story of systematic captivity, abuse, and murder spanning at least 3 years was told by the physical evidence. Among the remains, personal effects were found by investigators that allowed them to identify many of the victims, matching names to the missing persons reports that had accumulated on Thornton's desk. William Hartman, the cautious Missouri trapper who had disappeared in November 1898, was identified by the distinctive belt buckle his wife had described. Joseph Miller, the German immigrant whose size and strength had apparently made him a particular target for the sisters' selection process, was recognized by his unusual blonde hair, still clinging to his skull. The most damning evidence came from Mercy Caldwell's own documentation of her crimes. During the search of the main cabin, a detailed diary sewn into the lining of a quilt was discovered by investigators, its pages filled with Mercy's careful handwriting detailing every aspect of the sisters' operation. The capture of each victim had been recorded by her with dates and descriptions, noting physical characteristics she found desirable for her breeding program. Her complete conviction that she and Temperance were chosen vessels fulfilling divine purpose, preserving pure mountain bloodlines from the corruption of modern civilization, was revealed by the diary. Extensively from scripture she quoted, particularly Old Testament passages about fruitfulness and multiplication, weaving them into a twisted theology that justified every horror she had inflicted. Her attempts to force reproduction with captive men were documented by the diary, recording births and the frequent deaths of infants born in the underground chambers. No remorse was shown by her, only frustration when her experiments failed to produce the results she believed God demanded of her. Challenges that 1899 medicine and social services were ill-equipped to address were presented by the 3 surviving children to investigators. Dr. Henderson examined them thoroughly, documenting physical ailments that could be treated alongside psychological damage that could not. Sunlight had never been seen by the children. Normal human interaction beyond the sisters' twisted care had never been experienced, and to speak beyond primitive sounds they had never learned. When brought above ground, extreme fear of open spaces was shown by them, cowering from the sky as if it might attack them. In a state orphanage in Little Rock, Arkansas authorities placed them, where staff attempted to provide the specialized care these traumatized children required. The oldest child, a girl of approximately 7, eventually learned limited speech and could perform simple tasks, but never fully recovered from the years spent in darkness. Largely non-responsive to rehabilitation efforts remained the younger 2 children, their development so stunted by early deprivation that they could not adapt to normal human society. All 3 died young, with the oldest surviving only to age 14 before succumbing to pneumonia, her body weakened by years of malnutrition, and her spirit apparently unable to find reason to fight for survival in a world she had never been prepared to inhabit. Immediate and violent was the community response to the revelations. Within days of the raid, local families gathered at the Caldwell Homestead and burned every structure to the ground. The main cabin, the outbuildings, even the wooden doors that had concealed the cellar entrance were reduced to ash. No trace of the sisters' operation to remain was wanted by residents. No physical reminder of the horrors that had existed in their mountains. More than simple destruction of evidence of a crime was represented by the burning. An attempt to cleanse the hollow of evil, to erase from the landscape the place where such darkness had flourished, is what it was. After the fire, the cellar entrance was filled in with rubble and earth by locals, sealing the underground chambers where so many had suffered and died. The hollow itself was deliberately left unnamed on maps, referred to only as the cursed place where decent people did not venture. His official report was completed by Deputy Thornton in November 1899, documenting every aspect of the investigation with the same methodical precision he had applied throughout his career. A model for rural crime scene investigation became his report, demonstrating the importance of detailed documentation and systematic evidence collection, even in remote locations with limited resources. For decades, the case influenced Arkansas law enforcement procedures, contributing to arguments for improved communication between isolated counties and better coordination in missing persons investigations.